The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was constant, almost hypnotic, as Margaret pushed her cart down the narrow aisle of the grocery store. She came here every Thursday, at precisely 3 p.m., because it was the quietest time of the week. No crowds, no rushed mothers with screaming toddlers, no impatient teenagers darting between shelves. It was her time, a mundane ritual in a life that had settled into predictable monotony. She paused in front of the produce section, carefully selecting apples, her fingers brushing over their smooth surfaces. She liked things orderly, deliberate. There was a rhythm to her life that kept her from dwelling too long on the silence that greeted her at home or the echo of laughter she hadn't heard in years. Margaret was 54, divorced for over a decade, with grown children who called on holidays and birthdays but rarely visited. Her days were spent working part-time at the library and tending to her small garden. She told herself she was content, safe in her routines, her world quiet and manageable. But that day something, or rather someone, disrupted her well-worn script. She was reaching for a particularly vibrant Granny Smith apple when another hand, strong and youthful, reached for the same one. Startled, Margaret looked up, her eyes meeting a warm, boyish grin framed by a face that couldn't have been older than 30. "Oh, I'm sorry," the man said, withdrawing his hand with a sheepish laugh. "You go ahead." Margaret blinked, momentarily disoriented. "No, please. You take it," she said, her voice steady, though she felt an unfamiliar flutter in her chest. He hesitated, then picked a different apple. "Plenty to go around," he said with a wink. Margaret managed a small smile, unsure why her cheeks felt warm. She watched him as he turned to leave, his tall frame moving with an easy confidence. Something about the encounter lingered, a spark of light in her otherwise predictable day. Later, as she stood in line at the checkout, she saw him again, 2 lanes over, balancing a small basket of items. He caught her gaze and nodded, a simple gesture that felt strangely intimate, as though they were sharing a secret. Margaret quickly looked away, embarrassed by how flustered she felt. That night, as she prepared her solitary dinner, she found herself replaying the moment. The spark of his smile, the kindness in his eyes, the unexpected jolt of something she hadn't felt in years, a sense of being noticed. For the first time in a long while, Margaret's routine felt less like a comfort and more like a cage. Something had shifted, though she didn't yet have the words for it. The following week, Margaret returned to the grocery store at her usual time. She told herself it was habit, nothing more. Yet, as she rounded the produce aisle, her pulse quickened, her eyes flickering from shelf to shelf, scanning the crowd without admitting what or who she was looking for. She didn't see him. Of course not, she thought. Why would he be here again? The thought was both a relief and a disappointment. She shook it off, chastising herself for letting one fleeting encounter unsettle her. But just as she moved toward the bakery section, she heard a voice. "Back for more apples." Margaret turned to find him standing a few feet away, holding a loaf of bread in one hand and a carton of eggs in the other. His grin was as bright as she remembered, and for a moment, she felt frozen in place. "Oh," she said, her voice catching slightly. "I guess I'm predictable." "That makes 2 of us," he replied, nodding toward his sparse basket. "I always forget half the things I need, so here I am again." Before she could think of a reply, he added, "I'm Liam, by the way." "Margaret," she said, feeling oddly self-conscious as she tucked a strand of gray hair behind her ear. They exchanged a few pleasantries, the kind of small talk one might have with a stranger at a bus stop. Yet, there was an ease to the conversation that Margaret hadn't expected, as though they'd known each other longer than a few passing moments. "Well, maybe I'll see you around, Margaret," Liam said as he headed toward the checkout. He glanced back once, a fleeting look that felt deliberate. The next time they crossed paths, it wasn't by chance. 2 weeks later, Margaret saw Liam before he saw her. He was in the coffee aisle, inspecting a bag of dark roast. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure whether to approach him. But he looked up, and when he smiled, it felt like an invitation. "Hi again," he said. "You're not going to accuse me of following you, are you?" Margaret laughed softly, the sound unfamiliar even to her. "I think we might both be creatures of habit." That day, their conversation stretched longer. Liam told her about his job as a graphic designer and his love of hiking. He asked about her life, and she found herself opening up in ways that surprised her, sharing tidbits about her work at the library, her garden, even her children. Their encounters became more frequent after that, and each time, their conversations grew deeper. They discussed books and movies, favorite foods and places they traveled. He teased her gently, and she found herself teasing back, a lightness settling over her that felt almost foreign. She began to anticipate these moments, her solitary trips to the grocery store becoming a source of unexpected joy. One day, as they stood near the deli counter, Liam said, "You know, you're the most interesting person I've met in a long time." Margaret felt her cheeks flush. "I think you need to meet more people," she replied, her voice teasing but her heart racing. He shook his head. "I'm serious. You're easy to talk to. It's rare." For the first time in years, Margaret felt something stirring inside her, a sense of connection, of being truly seen. It scared her, but it also made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in decades. Margaret couldn't pinpoint the exact moment her feelings began to shift, but they crept in like an early morning fog, gentle, almost imperceptible, until suddenly, they were all around her. She told herself it was nothing, a harmless friendship, a simple pleasure amid her otherwise predictable life. Yet, each time she saw Liam, her pulse quickened. Each time he laughed at one of her jokes, or leaned in just slightly during their conversations, her breath hitched. It was a sunny Saturday when the realization struck her like a thunderclap. They were sitting on a bench outside the store, sipping coffee they'd picked up from the nearby cafe. Liam had convinced her to try an oat milk latte, and she was surprised to find she liked it. "You're full of surprises, Margaret," he said, his smile warm and unguarded. She chuckled, but his words lingered. No one had seen her as more than her roles, mother, employee, widow, for so long. Yet Liam seemed to see her, and it terrified her how much that mattered. When she glanced up, he was looking at her, his gaze steady and unflinching. For a moment, the world seemed to still, and Margaret felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: hope. Later that evening, as she watered the petunias in her garden, the memory of Liam's smile lingered. She felt a sharp pang of guilt. What was she doing? She was 54. He couldn't be more than 35. What kind of foolishness was this? She sank onto the garden bench, her watering can forgotten. Was it wrong to feel this way? She thought of her late husband, gone for nearly a decade, of her grown children, who assumed her life revolved solely around their sporadic calls and visits. And yet, when she thought of Liam, she didn't feel like a woman defined by her age or her past. She felt alive. That night, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as her thoughts spiraled. She imagined telling Liam about her feelings, and immediately winced at the absurdity of it. What would he think? What would anyone think? But another thought bubbled up, quieter yet insistent. What if he felt the same? Margaret sat up abruptly, the room bathed in the soft glow of the moonlight. She tried to dismiss the idea, but it refused to leave. She knew she had to keep her feelings hidden, to preserve the easy friendship they'd built. Anything more was impossible. And yet, as she drifted to sleep, her dreams were filled with the sound of his laugh, the warmth of his eyes, and the quiet thrill of being seen. For the first time in years, she woke up with a smile on her face, and a heart caught between longing and fear. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions Margaret had thought were long behind her. Each encounter with Liam, whether planned or coincidental, brought a strange mix of joy and trepidation. On a breezy Thursday afternoon, they ran into each other again at the grocery store. Margaret was standing in front of a shelf of pasta sauces, paralyzed by indecision, when she heard his voice. "Margaret, tell me you're not still deciding between marinara and arrabbiata," he teased, stepping beside her. She laughed nervously, clutching a jar. "Decisions like this require deep thought," he grinned, plucking a jar of arrabbiata and placing it in her cart. "Live a little." She rolled her eyes playfully, but her heart was racing. Even this small interaction left her feeling exposed, as though her secret feelings might spill out at any moment. That night, as she sat at her kitchen table, the unopened jar of sauce in front of her, she tried to make sense of her emotions. She felt like a teenager again, caught up in the giddiness of a crush. But she wasn't a teenager, and this wasn't a schoolyard romance. Margaret found herself torn between two opposing forces. On one hand, there was the undeniable warmth Liam brought into her life, a lightness she hadn't felt in years. On the other, there was the crushing weight of doubt and fear. What would people say? What if he didn't feel the same? The questions consumed her. She confided in no one. How could she? Her friends wouldn't understand, and her children would surely judge her. She was supposed to be the stable, dependable matriarch, not a woman caught up in a foolish fantasy. And yet, every time she tried to push the feelings away, they resurfaced with greater force. One evening, as she flipped through an old photo album, Margaret found herself reflecting on the woman she used to be, fearless, confident, full of dreams. When had she let those parts of herself fade? Liam's presence reminded her of that younger self, the woman who had once believed love could conquer anything. But could she take that leap again? The turning point came on a quiet Sunday morning. Margaret was walking through the park, hoping the fresh air would clear her mind. She spotted a young couple on a bench, their hands intertwined as they laughed at something on a phone. The sight filled her with both envy and longing. Love, she realized, was not a privilege reserved for the young. It was a force that could bloom at any stage of life, if only she had the courage to let it. But courage was easier said than done. That evening, she sat on her porch with a glass of wine, staring at the sunset and wrestling with her thoughts. The fear of judgment and rejection was still there, but so was the persistent hope that maybe, just maybe, this connection with Liam was something worth fighting for. For the first time, Margaret allowed herself to imagine a different kind of future, not one dictated by societal expectations, but one led by her heart. The thought both terrified and exhilarated her. Margaret paced her kitchen, the late afternoon sunlight pooling on the floor. She'd been mulling over her plan for days, rehearsing her words like lines in a play. Every time she imagined herself saying them, though, she faltered. The idea had come to her during one of their casual conversations at the grocery store. Liam had mentioned his love of gardening and how he missed having a yard to tend to since moving into his apartment. Margaret, glancing out at her own sprawling but neglected backyard, had blurted out, "I have plenty of room if you ever want to try your hand at it." He'd smiled warmly, but nothing had come of it until now. The memory of his enthusiasm had sparked a boldness she hadn't expected. Maybe this was her chance to bring him into her world without overstepping, to see if the connection she felt was real. But the courage to follow through eluded her. She thought of every possible outcome, from the mundane to the catastrophic. What if he said no? Worse, what if he said yes? And she found herself fumbling through the evening, unable to articulate what she truly wanted. The sound of her phone buzzing on the counter jolted her from her thoughts. It was a message from Liam. "Picked up some great herbs at the farmer's market today. Wish I had a place to plant them." Margaret stared at the screen, her heart pounding. This was her opening. Before she could overthink it, she typed back, "My yard's still available if you'd like to give it a go. No pressure, but I'd love the company." Her finger hovered over the send button for a full minute before she finally tapped it. The moment the message disappeared, she felt a surge of panic. What if he thought it was strange? What if he saw through her thinly veiled invitation? The response came almost instantly. "That sounds amazing. When works for you?" She exhaled, a mix of relief and exhilaration washing over her. After a few exchanges, they settled on the following Saturday afternoon. The days leading up to his visit were a blur of preparation. Margaret found herself fussing over details she hadn't cared about in years. The state of her flower beds, the patio furniture, even the kind of lemonade she'd serve. She oscillated between excitement and dread, convincing herself that it was just a casual visit, nothing more. But deep down, she knew this was a pivotal moment. Inviting Liam over felt like opening a door not only to her home but to possibilities she hadn't dared consider. On Saturday morning, as she arranged a basket of garden tools on the porch, Margaret caught her reflection in the window. Her cheeks were flushed, her hair pinned up in a way that felt both effortless and intentional. She smiled faintly, hardly recognizing the woman staring back at her. When the doorbell finally rang, her heart leapt. She took a steadying breath and opened the door to find Liam standing there, a small tray of potted herbs in his hands and that familiar, easy grin on his face. "Ready to make this garden the envy of the neighborhood," he teased. Margaret laughed, stepping aside to let him in. "I'm counting on you to work miracles." As they made their way to the backyard, she felt a flicker of hope beneath her nerves. This wasn't just about planting herbs or sprucing up her garden. It was about letting herself believe in something new, something alive, something hers. The afternoon passed in a blur of sun-dappled moments. Liam worked with quiet focus, his hands deftly planting herbs and rearranging pots. Margaret watched, surprised at how effortlessly he blended into her world. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the heavy weight of her solitude. His presence brought warmth to the space, like the sun itself had taken root beside her. They spoke in the easy rhythm of two people who had already found a gentle comfort in each other's company. At first, the conversation had been light, about plants, the weather, the best way to cook with fresh basil, but gradually it deepened. Liam shared stories of his childhood in a small town, his family's messy but loving dynamics, and his recent decision to move to the city. Margaret found herself listening more intently than she expected, drawn to the authenticity in his words. And then, somewhere between laughter and shared silence, it happened. She caught a glimpse of him as he turned toward her, his face bathed in the golden light of the late afternoon. His eyes, soft yet knowing, held hers for a long moment. There was something in his gaze, something that pulled at her in a way she couldn't define. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just the kindness she had come to know in him, nor was it the warmth of the sun that made her skin feel alive. It was something more, something that stirred deep within her chest. Her pulse quickened, and a knot of unease formed in the pit of her stomach. She had been denying it for weeks, dismissing it as a simple affection or a fleeting connection. But this was something else entirely. She realized, with startling clarity, that her feelings had shifted. What had once felt like the camaraderie of a new friendship had grown into something more, something powerful, magnetic, and undoubtedly complex. Liam smiled at her then, unaware of the whirlwind his presence had stirred inside her. "I think we're almost done here. Want to take a break?" Margaret nodded, her voice betraying a hint of uncertainty. "Yes, I'd love to." They sat together on the stone bench she'd placed under the oak tree, a perfect vantage point for the garden. The cool breeze was gentle against her skin, and the scent of fresh earth and herbs hung in the air. It felt like a moment suspended in time, peaceful, quiet, yet charged with something unspoken. "I'm really glad you invited me over," Liam said softly, his tone sincere. Margaret smiled, her heart fluttering. "I'm glad you came." The words felt heavier than they should, but she couldn't seem to stop herself. She wasn't sure if she was speaking to him or to herself, trying to make sense of the emotions swirling within her. Liam turned toward her, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he spoke, his voice low and steady. "I think I've been wanting to say this for a while now, but I wasn't sure how." Her breath caught, and for a split second, she felt a panic rise in her chest. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He met her gaze, his eyes soft and vulnerable. I think I've really enjoyed getting to know you. More than I expected." The weight of his words sank into her chest, leaving her breathless. She could feel the space between them shift, something undeniable moving between them. She swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. "I've enjoyed it too," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. There was a pause, a breathless moment where time seemed to slow. She was acutely aware of the way he sat beside her, the proximity of their bodies, the warmth of his hand near hers. For the first time since their meeting, she allowed herself to acknowledge the depth of her feelings. And then, as if some invisible thread between them had finally snapped, Liam reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against hers. It was a small gesture, barely perceptible, but it sent a ripple of warmth through her. Margaret's breath faltered. She could feel the undeniable pull between them, the tension in the air that seemed to crackle with possibility. It wasn't just the touch, it was everything. The gentle way he looked at her, the quiet moments they shared, the way her heart seemed to beat in sync with his. For the first time in years, Margaret felt like she was on the verge of something beautiful, something unexpected. But as the warmth of his hand lingered in hers, a wave of fear surged within her. What did this mean? What would happen after this moment? Could she really allow herself to feel this way? She wanted to say something, to speak the words that had been gnawing at her heart. But for now, she let the silence between them speak louder than anything she could have said. That night, as the shadows stretched long across the room, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, the soft light of a lamp casting a gentle glow over the scattered papers and open books. Her fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She couldn't seem to shake the feeling of Liam's touch, so light, so tender, yet it had burned into her memory. It wasn't the kind of touch that demanded anything. It was simply a gesture, but it felt like everything. A quiet declaration, a question, and maybe, just maybe, a beginning. Her mind had been racing ever since he left, replaying the afternoon in fragments, unable to let go of the strange, delicate shift that had taken place between them. The way he looked at her, the way they both seemed to hesitate, unsure of where the line between friendship and something deeper lay. But that wasn't it. There was more to it than that, something she hadn't fully allowed herself to consider until now. At 53, love felt like a distant, almost faded thing. Her marriage had ended years ago, and since then, there had been only the occasional date, nothing to ever spark the kind of connection she had with Liam. Her world, for so long, had been neatly contained within the walls of her routine. It was easy to accept loneliness when it became a part of who you were. Comfortable, even. But now, there was a quiet, pulsing ache in her chest that she couldn't ignore. Was this love? Could it be? She had seen the whispers, the glances, the judgment in others' eyes over the years whenever the topic of age differences came up. Her friends were kind, but there was always that underlying discomfort when it came to matters of romance and aging. "Isn't it a bit much?" they'd ask. "He's so much younger." It had always seemed like a fair question. She had accepted the stories society told her, stories of what was appropriate, what love was supposed to look like at her age. But Liam had shattered all of that. When she looked at him, she didn't see a younger man. She didn't see a reminder of what time had taken from her. No, she saw someone who made her feel something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in far too long alive. The doubts that had started to form in her heart, like whispered questions in the dark, were hard to quiet. Could she really have this? Could she let go of the fear that age would eventually create a divide they couldn't cross? But as she sat there, feeling the warmth of the evening seep into her bones, she realized something. It wasn't about the years between them. It was about the connection, about how, in his presence, she felt more herself than she had in a long time. How he listened to her, laughed with her, made her feel as though she was seen, not for her age, but for who she was. She thought of all the years that had come before, of the disappointments and the mistakes, but also of the lessons they had taught her. The life she had lived wasn't a path of regrets, but one of understanding. She had learned to value authenticity, to cherish the moments when she felt truly present in the world. Liam had brought that back into focus. He had reminded her that love could be more than just a memory. It could be something real, something new, something that hadn't yet been written. She smiled softly to herself, the edges of the tension easing as she realized that she didn't need to figure it all out tonight. Love wasn't a puzzle to solve. It was a journey, one that didn't have to follow any set rules, especially not the ones imposed by others. With a deep breath, Margaret stood up, her heart a little lighter than before. She wasn't ready to rush into anything, but the walls she had built around her heart were beginning to crack. For the first time in years, she wasn't just imagining what it would be like to be loved again. She could feel it. And whatever came next, whatever happened with Liam, she was ready to embrace it, without fear, without shame. Age had nothing to do with the capacity for love, after all. It was about the soul, about the moments that mattered. And right now, those moments were being woven into something beautiful, something unexpected. The world outside her window seemed to be breathing in time with her, and Margaret knew that she would follow wherever this feeling would lead her. Margaret woke the next morning to the soft, familiar hum of the city outside her window, the sunlight spilling through the curtains and casting gentle rays on the kitchen table where she had spent so many mornings alone. The quiet seemed different now, richer somehow, as if the space had been filled with something new, something that had gently shifted her understanding of what life could still offer. She smiled to herself as she sipped her coffee, remembering the evening before, the calm, the quiet, the way her heart had begun to thaw in ways she hadn't thought possible. It felt like she was standing on the edge of something profound, something uncharted, and yet it didn't scare her. It filled her with an exhilarating sense of possibility, a reminder that love didn't have an expiration date, nor did it need to follow the rules written by others. Love was about connection, about the moments that moved you, that made you feel truly alive. Margaret's thoughts drifted back to Liam. His smile, the way his eyes had sparkled when they spoke. He wasn't like the others. There was something about the way he made her feel seen, heard, valued, that was so pure, so unburdened by anything except the present moment. She hadn't expected it, and yet she couldn't deny the depth of the connection they shared. She thought about the things she had learned over the years, the quiet acceptance of solitude, the lessons in self-love, the way she had carved out a life that, while solitary, had always felt whole. But now, in the light of everything that had unfolded, she realized that love was a journey that never truly ended. It wasn't about the years or the numbers. It was about feeling seen, about finding that rare, special person who understood you, who made you want to be a better version of yourself. Liam had sparked something in her she hadn't realized was dormant. He had reawakened her heart, and for the first time in many years, she didn't feel like she was waiting for life to happen. She felt like she was actively participating in it. She wasn't naive enough to believe everything would be simple. There would be challenges, doubts, the world's judgment. But Margaret was done letting those things dictate her choices. She had spent so long playing by the rules, living within the confines of what was expected. But now she knew there was more to life than that. Love could come at any stage, from anywhere, and it could bring more joy and meaning than she had ever allowed herself to believe. As she stood up from the table, ready to face the day, Margaret felt something deep inside, a stirring of hope. No matter what the future held with Liam, no matter what others thought, she had learned that love didn't have to make sense to anyone else but the two people involved. And with that, she knew that she had nothing to fear anymore. Love, like life, was unpredictable, but it was also beautiful, messy, and worth every moment of uncertainty. So, with her heart a little braver and her spirit a little lighter, Margaret stepped into the new chapter of her life. The future was open, unmarked by the judgments of the past, and for the first time in many years, she felt the power of love, at any age, in any form, on her own terms. And that was enough.